Hey, everybody. Welcome to the GMI Rocket Show. Today is episode number 51. I'm super pumped and very grateful for my guest today because he is joining us all the way from Australia. And for anybody listening or watching this live, it's 4 o'clock here in New York City. It is 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday in Australia. So I'm in Melbourne, where our guest is. So I'm very, very grateful to him. So our guest today is Jackson Taylor, who is an immigration attorney, an Australian immigration attorney. He's the founding partner of immigration law firm Hammond Taylor, and he also has recently launched an immigration compliance tech company, a software company called Complize, which helps companies, HR departments, basically learn about and streamline and manage their immigration compliance. We're going to learn all about that. We're going to learn about how he got to where he is today, starting the law firm, how the tech sort of product was born and branched out of the law firm. So super exciting. I'm Roman Zelchenko. I always forget to introduce myself nowadays for some reason, but I'm your host. I am a former U.S. immigration attorney. I am now the founder of Laborless, which is an immigration tech startup automating H-1B compliance, so immigration compliance tech on the U.S. side. And I'm also the founder of GMI Rocket, which is a digital marketing agency focused on the immigration and global mobility space, and of course, which brings you this show. So without further ado, no more introduction. Jackson, thank you so much for being here, and good morning to you. Thank you for waking up so early and having us spend your morning with you.
Thank you, Roman. Absolute pleasure. And don't worry, I have 3 children under 5, so I'm used to being up at this time. This is just par for the course for me.
That's great. On Saturdays too, I guess. It doesn't matter what day of the week.
The weekends are my heaviest work day. My favorite days are Monday because that's the day that I get to go back to the office and hang out by myself, basically. The weekends are the work week for me, and the weekdays are my fun time.
I love it. And just for people who are listening, who aren't watching live, you're in your office right now, but you've got you've got fig tree behind you, I see, and then you've got your Complize logo. So it's a very cozy, really cozy office, which is cool.
Yeah, I don't live in Melbourne. I live just outside Melbourne. Okay. But when I got this space, it was just me. It still is just me. Theoretically, there's another person who works here, but they're 100% remote these days, and I wanted to make it feel homely. So you can't see it here, but I've got a couple of couches where I take a snooze, and I've got a kitchen table and a coffee machine, and yeah, it's just kind of like a home office out of home. So I'm very, very comfortable here.
That's really cool. I need to get one of those because my office is my home, and sometimes I do. It is nice to get out and kind of go to another space. Just before we jump in here, I want to say for folks who are watching or listening, thank you for watching and joining us. Shout yourself out, leave a comment, tell us where you're calling in from, what part of the world, what you do, just a little bit about, so we can give you a little shout out. And of course, ask questions along the way. As if you have any questions for Jackson or comments about anything he or I are saying, please drop them in the comments. Obviously, hit the like button if you're enjoying this conversation. It's always really nice to get some support and love from folks who are watching. So hope to see some of y'all in the comments. So Jackson, we actually met. So this is interesting because now I have, over the past year and a half, I've met a ton of people really amazingly through LinkedIn, through sort of digital means, and haven't met most of them in person. I was lucky enough to actually meet you in person in Prague right before the world was really shut down, which is crazy, February 2020. And when I think about it, I mean, COVID was already kind of around, obviously. It just hadn't really kind of spread across the world yet. And we were almost blissfully just enjoying ourselves in Prague during the conference. But it's nice to reconnect virtually. It was cool to kind of like talk to you. This was before you launched Complize. So Complize is a relatively new company, but I guess you're in lockdown right now, or I guess you guys just came out of lockdown, right? By Melbourne.
Yeah, so the state of Victoria has just come out of what we call lockdown 5.0, and foreseeing the chances for that to continue, I don't think that'll be the last one. But that was relatively brief. Our government sort of taken this very go early, go hard approach. So we were in lockdown, I think, for about 10 days, 12 days, and most things were shut. It was only essential retail. Schools were shut. For some reason, daycare centres continue. But it's been a strange experience. Victoria went through several months of very extended lockdown. I think it was, more than 100 days. I think it might have been sort of 4 or 5 months of lockdown last year, which was a real challenge for many people for all sorts of reasons. But no, I agree. It's fantastic to reconnect, and it is really, really strange that we met at the Prague conference, because it was weeks before the whole world sort of changed.
Yep.
And I remember we flew out through Singapore, and COVID was already in Singapore. And so we were very conscious, because my wife and I traveled with our little kids. And so we were very conscious of that. And then landing in Prague, it all felt safe. But then we continued on a holiday. We drove through Germany and France. And by the time we got to, Munich, it was in Bavaria. And then by the time we got to France, we were staying with friends in the countryside in Brittany, sort of 5 or 6 hours drive from Paris. And they were like, oh, yeah, people have got COVID in the next village, and weren't very concerned about it. And I was like, well, if COVID's there, it's here. It's not like there's walls between it, And then coming back, flying back into Australia, I think we were about just under 2 weeks before the cutoff when they closed the international borders. And that was a really, really strange time for us. I remember having a coffee catch up with a business group that I'm part of, and sort of saying, I don't want to sound crazy here, but this is going to be bigger than anything since World War II. And I felt a bit awkward comparing it to World War II, because we all know, that was such a huge deal. Probably one of the 2 or 3 biggest events of sort of, the 20th century. And people just laughed at me. People laughed at me. And I kind of felt, yeah, maybe I'm being a bit out there. But I think I may have been proven correct in that one. Sadly,
but yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we don't have to make this about the lockdown, of course, but I remember when New York City locked down, a lot of people were like, oh, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it'll kind of, and then, yeah, here we are. I mean, a year and a half later. So, but, hopefully things will be looking better soon. And, my hope is that we can all finally, thankfully, we're all, folks here healthy and alive and listening and watching, and hopefully can sort of meet to some extent in person in the near future. That's what I'm looking forward to. So are you originally from the Melbourne area? I mean, did you you were born and grew up in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is my hometown. It's about 200 kilometers out of Melbourne, in a sort of fruit growing dairy area. So very much farmland, irrigated farmland, quite fertile, known as the fruit bowl of Australia. And the town's called Shepparton. There's about 50,000 people. And it is a very, very multicultural place. It's one of the most multicultural places in Australia. It's attracted people for, sort of ever since settlement and colonization, because of its farming and the need for, because particularly with the orchards, the needs for itinerant farm labor. And so a lot of migrants were sort of directed to this area through time to be part of that labor supply chain. And so, Shepparton is quite small, but remarkably, it has communities from, going back sort of historically, some of the first non-Anglo Irish communities were Albanian, then a large Jewish influx after World War II, Italian, Greek, a lot of the Balkans and Yugoslavia. And then more recently, when I was at high school, for example, Iraq, there were a lot of Iraqi refugees, a lot of Sudanese, Congolese, Burundi.
Wow.
So this is one of the main areas that sort of new migrants are directed in Australia. And Shepparton kind of has this reputation for being one of the most successful sort of multicultural and most multicultural communities in Australia. And I think that's probably part of my journey as someone who comes from this part of the world, because multiculturalism can be controversial in the age of Trump, and I know that in Australia, for example, there was a big conflict 2 or 3 years ago about the construction of a mosque in a town very similar to Shepparton, only about 250 kilometres away, called Bendigo. Similar size, sort of 75,000 people, but it has a very white bread, very Anglo, what has often been called Anglo-Celt, so English and Irish community. And then there's been an influx of migrants more recently, in the idea of building a mosque, which has become very controversial and then taken up by some white nationalists and extremists as sort of a flag waving cause. In contrast, Shepparton's first mosque was built in 1963 by the Albanian community. And there are 2 mosques here, and there are, all sorts of other religious institutions, cultural communities, and so forth that don't, no one bats an eyelid. And yet 250 kilometers away, you've got people marching in the street about what to us isn't even an issue. So yeah, it's a great place to have grown up in, although it was very different before the internet. I must say, the world was very different. And I think I was thinking about this yesterday. The idea that I grew up in this small town in a small country, geographically far from a lot of the center of what we consider, the center of the world. It was a very information limited place. And it was somewhere where, for me, the most resources, the most information I could get was the local public library. And so I think both of those factors have sort of played into me growing up and becoming involved in immigration because of that interest with the outside world, with other cultures, with other communities, and so forth. So, yeah, I'm probably doing your job for you, Roman, but that's where I come from, and that's where I am back again today after sort of 20 years on and off in Melbourne.
That's fascinating. That's so cool to think about a relatively small town or city that is indeed so inclusive and so, and it shows, right? I mean, there's so many corporate studies done about how much diversity helps with, value creation, with people being, successful, with the company doing better. It's basically a no-brainer, and it's cool to see that has sort of had played out, kind of where you grew up, just naturally, right? People coexist, people bring in their own influences and their own information and experiences, and it sort of elevates everybody. I mean, that's sort of the points. Do you think that when you were growing up, were you conscious of this? Like, did this form? I know you're saying that now you're in the immigration industry, and surely that had an impact on you. Do you think that was a conscious thing for you, or were you just like, oh, here are my friends who happen to be from different parts of the world, and in school we try different types of foods, and we go into these different cultural institutions or religious? I'm just curious if it was sort of consciously on your mind, or it's something that you've just reflected on later on.
I mean, I think it was always something that we were aware of, and it's not to say that there weren't conflicts. For example, in high school, in particular, people identified with their various communities, and there were cliques and different groups, and there was sort of this perception of, oh, I'm from this group of people who are from the Mediterranean, or I'm from this different sort of, I'm an islander, or I'm a skip, which is what they used to call Skippy the kangaroo. I'm white, or I'm Aboriginal, or whatever it was. And so there were conflicts at times at different levels, but those groups also intermeshed and intermingled in different contexts. And so I think that was definitely something that I was aware of. And my interest in stuff overseas was also very much rooted in the historical. I was a big fan of, fantasy novels and historic fiction and that sort of stuff, and nonfiction as well. And so my interest came from wanting to go and see, castles in Europe, which I didn't get to see. And I think sometimes we forget how different the world has become in some respects in 20 years. I didn't get to go and see those sort of things until I was 16, 17. I didn't see snow until I was 16, 17, because, there wasn't a lot of mobility. Air flights used to be very expensive. And so my life was very much this small community here in Shepparton, with some exposure to the bigger city down in Melbourne, which is also quite a multicultural place. But white settlement in Australia is only 200 years old. The oldest buildings around here are about 100 years old, maybe 150.
Mm-hmm.
And so apart from, there's this kind of distinction, I guess, between Aboriginal history, which many of us white people can't see, which is sort of 60 to 70,000 years old, because we don't sort of see the way that they have interacted with the environment and understand that in the same context that we understand a castle from France that was built 500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, a lot of that desire to like, it was my own desire to travel, I guess, is what I'm saying. And as a child and as a teenager, I imagined my future would be living overseas, living in France, living in Europe, living in Asia, or wherever it may have been. But it's actually turned out kind of to be the opposite, where I live in Australia and I facilitate people to come to Australia. And I still get that engagement with people from all over the world and different cultures and different ideas and backgrounds. It's just that I'm introducing them to my home and to Australian culture, society, and all those sorts of bits and pieces.
Arguably, you're the right person for that, because you have such an interest in who they are and where they're coming from and what they bring with them, that you're kind of the best shepherd to say, here, welcome to my home. Do you, when you were younger, just because we're going to get to everything you've started, you launched a law firm, you launched, Complize. Were you kind of an entrepreneurial type of teenager or kid? Like, were you kind of like the window washing, car washing, paper route type of, or not? I'm always curious about this, because I wasn't. I feel like I was too scared, or I never thought I could, or I don't know, whatever it is. I have to probably explore that on my own, to be honest with you. But I'm curious, did you have any of that when you were younger?
I think I was stuck between two different realities in that respect. Like, my personal interest was very much in things that were academic, and that was quite unusual in itself in a place like Shepparton. Like, I didn't know people who were doctors growing up. I didn't know people who worked in big buildings down in Melbourne, what they did. Sort of growing up and being a young adult, sort of 12, 13, I sort of thought the things that you could do in life were, you could work in a shop, you could own a shop, you could be a teacher. That was kind of it. There was sort of a limited range of things in the world that you could do. That said, my interests were in the academic, and I sort of wanted to go to university and thought I'd be a university lecturer or something like, do something like that, something outside the world that I knew. And so, no, I wasn't entrepreneurial in the slightest. But on the other hand, my parents, who come from quite a sort of working class background, bought business which used to make kitchen cabinets for homes and for offices and stuff like that. And so they bought that when I was about 5 or 6, and I grew up in a household where a lot of the dinner time chat was about what was happening at work, and really simple stuff like customer service, and what did these customers say, and what were these expectations of the customers, and what was the person who was working in the factory doing, and what were the conflicts between my parents, who were the managers, and people in the factory, and these sort of things. So I did grow up in an environment where often business was being discussed. And my dad was a real ideas man. Like, I remember in the late 80s driving around, and he was like, "Oh, I'm going to open a video store," which was kind of the big thing of it was like the tech startup of the late 80s, right? And so I was exposed to that, but it wasn't really until at least my late 20s that seemed like a possibility for me. Because I think a bit like what you were saying about being scared or feeling that you didn't necessarily have something particular to offer, I think that was kind of it. I think my journey to becoming a business person was, okay, so I've got these really great skills as an immigration lawyer. How can I use those to leverage that into business? And then that's when all those ideas that had always been present and discussed with my parents and my family around the dinner table came to the fore. So that's kind of, I think, how the two sides of that journey, I think mine probably maps just the same way. It is interesting. I find it so fascinating to hear about people who, like, 12 years old, and they said, I spent my $10 to buy a bucket and a mop and some soap, and I walked around and cleaned people's houses, and I figured the soap and the mop would cost me
$20 and I would make $50. And I'm like, I'm so always impressed and amazed at people who are kids when, thinking about that. So you eventually, before you became an immigration lawyer, so I understand you went to university, graduated, and then you sort of eventually became a migration agent, right? Your first job, I believe, at least what I've seen, is you worked at Fragomen, which is, of course, one of the world's largest immigration firms. How did you, can you talk a little bit about that? You wanted to be, I presume that you liked academia, you liked university, you liked studying. I know you've gone on to get multiple degrees, of course, a law degree as well. What was that sort of like? You graduated, and then did you know you wanted to go into migration or immigration, or how did you get that first job? How did that actually happen?
Yeah, sure. I mean, going to university, one of the key challenges was that I was the first person in my family to do so, and I didn't really understand much of the things that I understand now about how once you get to, there's a million arts graduates, right? So how do you stand out as an arts graduate? You need great marks, but you also need all these extracurricular activities, and you need to go and do your internships and this, that, and the other. And I didn't kind of understand that, and I didn't have the people around me, or if the people were around me, I didn't seek counsel from them about achieving those things, right? I sort of was a bit blasé. Yeah, I'm doing my thing. I was probably busy at the pub somewhere having a drink rather than thinking about what my next internship would be, and came out of the end of this arts degree pipeline going like, wow, I've got a really average arts degree. What do I do now? And I actually ended up in commercial recruitment, which is a strange world, doing recruitment for big IT firms in Australia. And I didn't like the job. It was super duper salesy. It was quite sleazy. It was almost like a 1980s sort of Wolf of Wall Street culture. There was cocaine and lots of crazy parties, and it was pretty bonkers. And I didn't enjoy that. I liked the parties. I didn't enjoy the sales culture. And so around that time, I was in a relationship with a girl from Malaysia, who was coming in and out of Australia, probably in a way that she shouldn't have been, working for a multinational consultancy company. And we were like, well, how can we be together? We had this brief sort of romance, and then she'd gone back overseas, and we stayed in touch, and she came back, and we were like, yeah, you're coming and going, but how can we actually be together? And then I started to sort of think about visas. I'd never really contemplated visas in any real sense, and it seemed really hard. And so while I was looking around at how we could be together, I came across a short course to become a migration agent. And I had a friend from university who was working at the Department of Immigration at the time. And I was like, oh, I'm thinking about doing this course to become a migration agent. And she was like, don't do it. Migration agents are super sleazy. They're all awful. It's a terrible industry. It's like the car salesman of the legal world. Just don't do it. And I was a bit baffled. And the more I looked into it, the more I thought that it was a good idea. And so I did that part-time online while I was working. And at the end of the course, I was like, yeah, I don't like the recruitment thing. I've been doing it for 2 years now. I've gained 20 kilos. I'm super stressed out. I want to go and do something else. And so I got really super duper lucky. I interviewed at Fragomen. I understand there was another candidate who was offered before me, who I've since met, I believe, in another, in that sort of immigration journey as you go along. So at the end of 2007, I got offered this job at Fragomen. I was the second candidate, but the first one turned it down. I started working at Fragomen, and I had a great time. I mean, it wasn't always easy. I think we all know that Fragomen is sort of high volume, low complexity in some ways. If you want to be negative about it, it's a bit of a visa factory. But at the same time, the opportunities were amazing, getting to interface with HR from the biggest companies in the world. It was a relatively small office in Melbourne, 20 people. And the culture and the environment was really supportive and wonderful. There were times where we were all super duper frazzled, but just that experience really showed me that this was something that I could enjoy. I enjoyed the process. I enjoyed becoming a subject matter expert slowly. And so I started doing basically what I consider an apprenticeship, learning the ins and outs and being around some really wonderful people who'd been in the industry for, 10, 20 years and who were just these amazing sources of knowledge. And, there were no pretensions. It was a very flat organization. Everyone was very approachable. And it was a great first place to work in migration. But yeah, so I sort of came to migration ultimately through accident. The career lasted, the relationship did not. And to be honest, there are sort of not many people I find that have come to immigration because they were like straight out of school. They're like, yeah, I want to do visas, or yeah, I want to do court work, or full visas, or whatever it is. But that falling in love and finding the world of immigration isn't. I'm not the only one, I think, is the answer.
Yeah. I mean, we had one of our previous guests, Sam Stoddard, who started a company called Simple Citizen, started it because his now wife, at the time fiance, foreign national, coming in, and he was dealing with this whole process. He had an immigration lawyer, just not a great experience. And he's like, why is this so difficult? I just want to get married to this person. And there's this process. Why is it so, why is it so manual, et cetera, et cetera? So it definitely, that motivation is there when it's not just even for just a paycheck, it's for a partner, it's for, for love, I guess, if we want to be poetic about it. I want to just take one small pause here. Marianne says hi from Chile and foggy San Francisco. Hey, Marianne, thank you as always for watching and tuning in. And Marianne says, I love Prague, my ancestral homeland, which is awesome. I love Prague too. That was the first time I was there last March. And man, the food was great. It was beautiful, so clean. Everyone was so nice. The history, of course, is incredible, especially just with regards to not even World War II, but all of the different periods, I guess, that Prague went through, and the Czech Republic, previously Czechoslovakia. Noor Yasmin says hi from Malaysia, all the way from Malaysia. Thank you so much for being here and for joining.
And a big shout out to Noor, because I think it's about 4:30 in the morning in Malaysia. So thank you, Noor. Really appreciate it.
And Noor, thank you also for sharing this. Noor was super excited, so I'm really grateful for you for being here, for watching. H1B guy from YouTube. Looking forward to hearing from Jackson on success stories of the merit-based system in Australia for high-skilled immigrants. Let's get there. We'll get there.
Merit-based.
I think there's a lot of interesting differences between the U.S., of course, system and the Australian system. So I definitely want to touch on that. Marianne says, and the Charles Bridge at dawn. Wow. Yes, the Charles Bridge is beautiful. Just down the Old Town, I think it's called, in Prague, if I remember correctly. It was beautiful. So I want to. You're working at Fragomen. You're getting this experience. You're a migration agent. Just for folks listening and for myself too, can you just very briefly explain what a migration agent does? Because this is something that, at least in the U.S., we don't really have. We do have some version of it. We have what's called an accredited representative, who can actually sort of represent somebody in very limited immigration proceedings. But for the most part, you have immigration lawyers, and that's it. And of course, support staff. Canada has immigration consultants who go through a course. Is it something similar in Australia, where if you're a migration agent, you help with some of the work, but you can't, let's say, go to court on their behalf? Like, can you just share a little bit about what that actually entails?
Yeah, sure. So in the late 80s, early 90s, what the government found was that there were people who were assisting interested parties to seek visas and assistance with immigration matters, and they weren't registered. There was no requirement, strictly speaking, to be registered to do this. There were lawyers at the same time who were providing more of, I guess, what you would call sort of the legal side of things. So less the visa work, more the appeals and the complex issues. And so in 92, the government set up a framework for migration agents. And very controversially, they made a requirement for Australian lawyers to also be migration agents. So it's a bit like being a patent attorney in Australia, where you have to be a lawyer as well as a patent attorney.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this sort of dual registration requirement imposed in '92. And the legal fraternity was quite upset about that. They took it to the High Court. They lost on a split decision, very, very narrow. But that regime has lasted almost 20 years, up until earlier this year, where migration agents and lawyers were separated out. So during that period, you could be a migration agent without being a lawyer, but if you were a lawyer, you had to be a migration agent. And the migration agents have had sort of the course and the nature of the course and the regulation around professional conduct and this sort of stuff has evolved significantly over that time. I'm actually one of the representatives on a government panel talking about changing the way migration education regulation operates at the moment. But what's happened is that course has become more and more formalized. It's become longer and longer. It went from being sort of just an exam that you sat, much like a US sort of bar exam style thing, but much more limited, to being a 6-month course, to being a 12-month course. And now discussions are becoming a 2-year course and this sort of thing. And then, migration agents can only assist with visa applications and appeal to the first level of sort of tribunals. Okay, so in the Australian visa system, you've got your first level decisions, then after that you've got appeals to administrative tribunals, and then to the court system. So migration agents can assist up to that tribunal level, but not in the court system. And so you've got this challenging question of, okay, so people are saying the 1-year course isn't providing enough training about X, Y, and Z, because it's really just focused on migration. It's not, and it touches, I guess, on the fundamentals of the legal system, but it's pretty restricted in scope in what you can teach in a year. And then you've got a law degree, which in Australia is 4 years. Okay. Why would we increase the migration course to 2 years? Aren't we getting to the point where it's not worth what you get in terms of being able to advise in this very narrow field isn't worth it, versus just completing the full 4-year course and you can advise in any area of law? And so there's this sort of tension. I guess I've got a bit off topic, Roman, but there's this kind of tension. There's always been a tension, I think, between the two professions to some extent, and it has been antagonistic at times. But at the moment, in seeking to make the migration agent profession sufficiently rigorous and well regulated, and the people come into it with enough knowledge, because there's no migration agents don't have a period of supervised practice, for example. So that's one of the things that's being discussed in this new sort of regime that the government's looking at putting forward. How do you balance those things? Because you've obviously got this quite high sort of threshold with the lawyers and a much lower threshold with migration agents. But despite that, you're both advising on these matters that can be life and death for people.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. I think that there's in the US, we also have this whole undercurrent of notarios, what they call, which are people who basically unscrupulously provide, pseudo legal immigration services. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that. To your point, it's always, of course, going to be a delicate balance. Attorneys, rightfully so, feel maybe like there's an encroachment on their business because they spend all this time, they have this, degree, but at the same time, some people don't need a full, suite of legal representation. They have a simple case and they need sort of just narrow, skilled help. But it's interesting. Thank you for sharing that, because I didn't quite know, of course, the nuanced details. So I guess as you were working as a migration agent, it sounds like, you took the course at the time. It was a little bit shorter, it sounds like, than it is now. And you've had, you're working for this really large firm. You then eventually decided to go back to law school, or to further your education in law school, and become an attorney, and of course, an immigration attorney. Can you just share kind of why you did that? Is it you just wanted to do more? I mean, you wanted to learn more and have more of an impact?
I think, to be frank, it became obvious to me in Fragomen that as much as it was a system that sort of accepted migration agents, and there wasn't any sort of discrimination between the two groups, which I must say has existed in other firms. It was pretty obvious to me that if you wanted to climb the ladder, that being a lawyer was the way to go. And so I went back sort of part-time, out of hours, to do the law degree. And a bit like getting into migration, the law degree lasted, the job at Fragomen didn't. So I was at Fragomen for about 5 years. I didn't finish my law degree in the time that I was there. I continued studying and working in the field. But it just became obvious that I think it was easier to get ahead from a professional perspective. But also, I did want a deeper level of engagement. You're absolutely right. I looked at, okay, so here I am. I'm sort of 30 years old. What is it that I want? If I'm going to continue in this career, I want to do it in a way where I'm actually going to be a subject matter expert. I'm actually going to have this sort of broader understanding of the field and of what immigration means. So I think that was probably the biggest driver.
So you eventually, you became an attorney. Did you practice law anywhere else before you launched your own firm?
Yeah, so this is part of the interesting journey of this sort of overlap that's existed between being a migration agent and being a lawyer. So what I did was I continued to work as a migration agent. I worked at another couple of places while finishing my degree. Right. I then went away and did what we call sort of legal practice training, which is a requirement to become admitted as a solicitor in Australia or a legal practitioner. And after that, during that, I went out and started my own business. Okay, so that was sort of an opportunity. My wife's a doctor. She was moving states to work in a different place. It was a good time to sort of say to my boss, hey, look, I got to go. I'm going to go with my wife, do the legal practice training. I started my own business while I was there, wearing my migration agent hat, and then continued doing that for some time. And around 2015, I met a person who had their own practice, James Hammond. We sort of met through the sort of social scene that's there for the migration industry, and hit it off pretty well. We had some friends in common, and we sort of worked together for a few months, and then made a decision to sort of join our practices. And so I didn't actually complete that formal supervision period until I was working in that newly merged company.
Was it scary for you to go off on your own and say, I know you started this migration sort of business, but it sounds like you knew that was going to be somewhat temporary, I guess, because you're kind of with your wife while she's doing her training. You're sort of you're still going through this practicum, and I'm assuming that eventually the idea was to probably work at a law firm. Maybe you go back to Fragomen, maybe you join another immigration firm, but then here you have this person, and then you're like, you know what, let's just do it ourselves. And the reason I ask about whether or not you were sort of entrepreneurial when you were younger is because it is scary. From my experience too, to start your own thing, and not just on the side where you have, income coming in from a job and you start something like, no, this is what you live on. So I was just curious, kind of, was it an easy decision to make? Was it, you relied on this, your partner who already had experience, or were you just like, you know what, it feels right, let's try it?
I think it was the latter. It feels right, let's try it. And it happened at that time where I had that opportunity to move states, which, in Australia, people aren't as mobile as they are in the US. There's a lot more geographic mobility in the US than there is in Australia. People in Australia tend to stick in the states that they were born in. And so moving states for me, even albeit temporarily for this rotation that my wife was completing, was a big break for me. And it was also an opportunity to sort of, I didn't want to be seen to be cutting my boss's lunch in some respects. I felt that it was sort of improper to just walk out the door and set up a business across the road to some degree. And so being in another state gave me a bit of space to do that. It also gave me the time to do that because it was part-time while I was studying. And you're right, it was scary, but it was something that I'd known for a long time. I think even then, looking back, Google Drive was around, and I think even back then in sort of 2014, I was looking around in my own files and seeing plans from sort of 2011, 2012 about setting up my own business in migration, and some of the ideas that I had and the plans I had, because I think having that background growing up with mum and dad, who were always looking at how could you do it better, how could you, like, I think they were early practitioners of what they call service design. Yeah, like I remember going into shops and you'd go like, why is the queue over there, or why is the counter there, and why are we like, this doesn't make any sense. And so that idea of doing things yourself and doing things better was always there for me. And so even though I was working at Fragomen, at times I was still having these ideas. I'm going to go out and do it myself. This is what I'd do if I. And it might also come down to a bit of hubris and a bit of a sense that I know better than other people. But so it was part of that sort of journey. I don't think it was unexpected. Like these things for me, I think happen 3 or 4 years after I start thinking about them. I think to some degree I am a risk taker. And my wife, I think, would say too much of a risk taker, but they're not sudden. It's not something that's just going to happen. I think it's sort of 2 to 3 years after I start thinking it, the blocks start to form in my mind. And then when I'm sort of, oh, okay, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. And I think that's kind of what happened. And in terms of the practicum and the supervised practice and this sort of stuff, there were a couple of options that were open to me, and they were somewhat controversial even back then. This was a big area of dispute when the migration profession sort of demerged from this deregulation. Had a lot of people in the migration industry who had been in a similar position to me, but who weren't willing to go into these partnership arrangements like I did to get that the lawyer status. And I think what the other option that was always there was that you grow your practice to the size where you can all of a sudden employ an attorney. And one of the things about Australia is, in the US, I think attorneys have a higher status in terms of, a junior lawyer can receive a hell of a lot more money than a junior employee from another field. Where in Australia, there is such an overwhelming glut of law students that they have one of the lowest levels of graduate salaries.
Wow.
And so it's quite feasible in my mind for you to find a lawyer who has an existing solo practice, for example, who is looking to retire, buy out the firm, have them as an employee, and have them supervise you. So that was kind of the other option that was there in my mind. That didn't really eventuate. James and I really hit it off. We had very, very shared values, and I really respect how much. There's very few people in Australia who can practice in all areas of Australian migration. Like it does tend to sort of, you do H1Bs, or you do the asylum, or you do the skilled stuff, or the family stuff. But James really has the ability to work across all of those areas. I don't, and that was something that I really respected. And so I think from that perspective, the partnership would really make sense.
Yeah, definitely. Some of these people, even I know some of them too, they're just walking encyclopedias. They know everything about every type of immigration case. And it's so incredibly impressive, really. So you're working with, you start the firm, you're supporting, I guess you're focused on business immigration, or you do all sorts, because I guess it sounds like you're able to do everything, family, business, maybe asylum. Where does the technology piece come in? Because clearly, it sounds like you're the type of person who you're doing something, you have an idea, and then you start mulling over the idea for a few years, and then eventually, for whatever reason in life, it comes to fruition. So you're working at Fragomen, you had ideas of what you would do if you had your own practice. When life served you the opportunity, you took it. I suspect that you probably were also like, oh, this would be great to have technology around. This would be great to have a digital option. And then, of course, you take your time, you spend it, researching, writing things down, and then you eventually implement. How did that happen? I mean, what instigated or what inspired you to start thinking about technology within immigration compliance? And what were some of those steps that you took in the beginning to create what is now Complize?
Sure. I think, I'm of a generation where we're on the cusp. I'm not a digital native, as my younger brother, who's sort of 5 or 6 years younger than me, might be considered. For me, the internet sort of was 16. I was 16 when the internet actually started to sort of be readily available and that sort of stuff. And so I was always interested in technology, but not thoroughly versed in it. I wasn't someone who went off and learned to code or anything like that. But it was always around, and it was always sort of, I was riding that wave in some respects. People got email when I was 16, and then by the time I was 18, like, first going to university, like, email was your main communication connection with the university, for example. And then when I started at Fragomen in 2008, the immigration system had already gone digital in Australia. It wasn't completely digital, but some of the main visas were digital, and that was obviously a really big change that had sort of happened in the 2 to 3 years previously. But that fact that immigration has been digital the whole time throughout my career, I think, has been in the background there. And as time has gone by, the Australian immigration system has become almost entirely digital. They've removed most of the channels to actually communicate by phone or through even offices. You can't physically go to an office in Australia anymore of immigration. It's all online. And so I think my journey with technology has really accompanied the department and the government's journey. But we've always been ahead as consumers and individuals, because we know that for the most part, government technology lags, sort of 5 to 10 years behind. And so when you're using the immigration system and you're like, oh, this is silly, why are they asking the question this way? Or why doesn't this field work? Or why have they done that? There's always this desire from my part to do it better and to fix it. And to, oh, well, why aren't they doing this and why aren't they doing that? And chances are they know that as well. They've just got to spend $10 million to fix a field that doesn't work, right? So that's kind of, I think, part of it. But the other part was that at Fragomen, I was exposed to some of the best practitioners in Australia, and they were early movers in this space. They had a sort of compliance product as far back as 2012, but the market wasn't ready for it. We hadn't moved to cloud computing. Organizations weren't ready for non-server based sort of services of this nature. Mm-hmm. They saw that as a risk. And so, the compliance piece in particular had sort of, I'd always been aware of it in some respects, because I'd seen it at Fragomen and what it could do, and I saw its potential, even if the clients didn't. And I think, sometimes that happens when you work in a field. The clients don't get it, but you do. And then over time, it's just been, it's so obvious that there's no going back in immigration. When I lived in Italy as a sort of backpacker in 2006, and there was a great big book down at the police office, this big, and they'd open it up and they'd write your name in and your passport number, and it's like, that's how it was managed, right? It was a big book. No one is doing that, right? No one is going back, oh, this database, that's rubbish. We're going to go back to writing it in the book. So there's only one way forward in immigration, and it's more digitization. It's more access. It's, the future is, for better or worse, facial recognition scans. It's not going back to digital passport numbers. It's, it seems to me pretty straightforward that there's only one track in this process, and it is greater integration, greater digitalization, and you're either going to be in it or you're going to be out of it as an immigration lawyer, because the future that we're talking about here in Australia, there's a textbook that just came out, I don't have it to hand, about the automated state, algorithmic decision making, non-human decision making in administrative law. This is what we need to be thinking and talking about, because governments, cost cutting, et cetera, neoliberal state, that's the direction that this is all going.
So how did you guys go from, all right, we need to do this. This is clearly moving in the direction of more automation, more technology. Why compliance, I guess? Maybe that's, and I say this, we talked about this for a little bit before we went live, but, I come from the same place. I practice U.S. immigration law. We already had, obviously, technology. I was looking at the parts of it that were not really digitized, probably the same way as you, thinking, how can I make this better, right? How can I use technology to make this process better? So that was my personal experience. I've literally automated part of what I used to do, which is much easier than finding someone else's problem. You solve your own, right? Yeah. So was it kind of, because Complize is a immigration compliance tech solution, Was it that you were handling compliance for your clients, for the firm's clients, thinking to yourself, wow, we've got maybe a case management software, we're able to do e-signatures, we're able to file certain things with, with Home Office, is it, or Department of Home Affairs?
Home Affairs, yeah.
Nice, great. Right, so like you're doing all that, but then when it comes to this compliance thing, it's just awful for ABC reasons. Was it that? I mean, were you solving your own compliance problems, thinking about how you can implement it with technology? Or if not, I'm curious how you got into it from a compliance angle.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. That would make more sense, but it wasn't. We were actually looking at other problems from the technology perspective. And then there was this thing called COVID-19, that we talked about. And the challenge in Australia was that the borders closed, right? So we went from an average of 2 million movements a month to 20,000, 1% of the movements. And we were like, okay, so the international piece of our work, so we do the family, the skilled, the what we call individual independent work. But we also do probably 65% is the employer focused stuff. And a lot of that, probably 65% would have been international movements. They're gone now. That area of our business is gone, puff, overnight, because the borders have closed. Or at least it's greatly reduced. What's left? And it became very obvious that looking at all of the information, there were still 1.7 million temporary visa holders in Australia. Now, that might not sound like a lot to someone from the States, but there's only 27 million people in Australia, right? So those people are still here. Organizations still need to comply with the law. And it's been very obvious for 10 years or more that compliance is one of those things that a bit like technology, not quite the same, but it is advancing towards more rigorous, structured systems with more significant penalties, et cetera, et cetera. There's obviously a whole bunch of other policy issues floating around in the background about nativism and local work rights and these sort of things that can sort of drive it or not. But compliance as a thing is really challenging. And I know that from my experience, 90%, 99% of organizations aren't fully compliant, many of them way off it. And so to go from either no compliance system at all, which would be the majority, or at best an Excel spreadsheet, which is spottily applied, to an actual computer system which can proactively trigger a notification. Hey, your HR systems told us that Roman's no longer a software developer. You've moved him to be a barista. That's not gonna work. Here's a red traffic light. It made a lot of sense. And compliance is one of those things where no one gets up. Very few people get up in the morning and go, I want to go and make sure that my business complies with the law. But if you don't, I saw a penalty in the US system the other day from a few years back of $95 million. Sorry, was it 95 million? Yeah, $95 million, right? And in Australia, someone went to jail recently for preferring unlawful workers to work on a farm. The penalties are real, right? And so we've spent the last 12 months sort of building that platform and trying to educate clients about, hey, wait, no, you really do need this. And basically, that's how it's come about. And I think there's a large piece, as we were saying before the show, about education. We need to educate the clients that this is necessary. But I think one of the big precursor events that really made me aware that compliance was a viable option in this space was what we call in Australia wage theft or employer underpayments. And the scenario would be you steal $100 from the till, you're going to go to jail, right? Or at best, you go to court and you get a warning. Your employer underpays you $100. What you're going to do about it? The police don't want to hear, etc. And so in Australia, we had this huge historical problem of underpayments in the hospitality sector. The hospitality sector was just known. No one paid the award wage. Australia's got a very structured wage salary system concept coming from 1910 harvester case, fair days pay for a fair day's work, right? But no one was complying. And everyone just thought, that's just the hospitality industry. They'll just get away with it. They have forever. And in the last 24 months, some of Australia's biggest known chefs, including one of the guys from MasterChef, lost his $20 million hospitality empire, collapsed under the weight of wage underpayments. Wow. Right? Because the regulator went in and they were like, hey guys, guess what? You guys haven't been paying the right wages for years. You guys owe millions of dollars in wage back pay.
Wow.
And so when you see that a regulator is capable of that sort of 180-degree turn, you realize, well, and the thing about it is, like, immigration compliance, it's got a 7-year lifespan. It's not about what you do today. What you do today is going to affect you for 7 years. It's about what you did 2 years ago,
Right.
3 years ago. So if organizations don't realize, they need to be told that if they're not complying now, the CEO could go to jail in 5 years. It's that sort of stuff, I think, that made us realize that, this is feasible, this is real, and it's something that people should be doing, even if they're not.
So can you talk a little bit about how Complize works? Like, what does it do? Who's the target audience? Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. At this stage, it's 3 modules. The first module is essentially like I explain to clients, it's like a HRIS for your visa holders. So it manages all of the data around visa holders, everything from visa expiries, the occupation, the salary that you've stipulated. Visa conditions are very important in the Australian system. So, for example, a sponsored worker may only be allowed to work in a specific occupation, at a specific location, for a specific employer. But then for a student visa holder, they've got things like a 20-hour, a fortnight limit, right? So you've got these very different conditions on the visas, which are hard to manage if you've got a workforce of 10,000 people, right? So the main part of that database is really built for organizations with large volumes of non-citizen employees who have these divergent obligations from the employer side. And it's designed to ultimately integrate with your payroll so that it can say, well, hang on, this person's on a student visa, you can't employ them more than 20 hours a week, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's records management, reporting, also like compliance notifications. So in theory, in the system, if even one of your job duties on your job description changes, there's supposed to be a notification to Home Affairs, right? So using Excel, that's not going to happen. But using our system, you're going to be able to do that quite easily. The second part is compliance certification, much along the lines of what everybody's been forced to do, anti-money laundering and terrorism compliance training. We've got 10 modules designed for everyone from just your stock standard Australian employee to the visa holder, to line managers, to HR, to the executive, about their responsibilities, their liabilities, etc. So that's really intended to be sort of a minimal involvement, from as little as 10 minutes a year for someone who doesn't have a visa, to sort of maybe an hour a year for someone who's in the executive. And then the third module is knowledge resources, because in Australia, you've either got the Department of Home Affairs website, which is inaccurate, out of date, incomplete, or you pay a subscription fee of, $1,500 US for the access that lawyers and migration agents have to the actual government policy behind the scenes, which is actually what the department is telling its own staff about what the law is. And there's nothing in between.
Wow.
So our solution is in between. It's directed at HR, at in-house legal, at internal organizational stakeholders to understand immigration, because we do have clients who manage their own visas. We don't do the visas. They're a hospital, they're a research institute, they're a university. We just give them the knowledge so that their internal specialists, who are often not lawyers, very few are lawyers in Australia. We don't have the scale that most organizations can have an in-house immigration lawyer. So we provide them with the knowledge and the resources to manage it themselves. So those are the 3 modules. I think in terms of the client base, really at this stage, it's for the larger organizations. And because of that piece around needing to educate people, we're really focused on organizations who care about compliance anyway. There's no point going out and trying to tell the dodgy bloke down the road who's trying to underpay his staff that he needs to pay, $10,000 a year to manage immigration compliance. We're focused on organizations who have corporate values around corporate social responsibility, social governance, around B Corps and purposeful organizations who really care about their reputation in the market.
Yeah, I find that there are different types of companies that have a different threshold for risk, let's put it that way, when it comes to compliance. Sometimes companies are like, look, we understand that we're not doing it, exactly 100% the way that we're supposed to, but that's okay. They have a risk acceptance, maybe because it streamlines their process, maybe because they don't care, maybe because they think they can get away with it. But, to your point, there's one thing to educate people about what you do, what your product does. And then if what you do aligns with what they need, great. That's an easy win where they can really benefit from your software. There's another sort of form of education, which is educating people on the fact that them being non-compliant is not a good thing. Sometimes it is what it is. But I think I personally don't like to sell from a place of fear, for example. But to your point, sometimes something happens where a company is hit with a large fine, some kind of maybe a criminal violation, a business is really impacted in a pretty powerful way. And then everyone who previously maybe was a little bit more wishy-washy with their compliance might all of a sudden sort of want to buckle up and really focus more on compliance. So it's interesting. It's definitely interesting. It's one of those things where you think like, well, but you have to do this, right? So it's a no-brainer, but just because you have to doesn't mean people will, which I find interesting.
No, I agree. And I mean, it's not something that I've been unaware of. I remember working at Fragomen way back and working with some major multinational oil and gas companies and being like, you can't do this. And they're like, yeah, we're company X. We can do whatever we want. The government's not going to touch us. And you're absolutely right. Whether it's you're at that level and you just think that you're untouchable, or whether you think that you're so small that the government's not going to come looking, or that you just don't care.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of positions where you're not going to convince someone. But that's why we're focused on organizations who actually already care. And we haven't had the significant financial penalties in Australia, but we've had some scandals, in particular with 7-Eleven, which is obviously an American brand name. 7-Eleven were in the papers for 24 months over coercion of temporary visa holders, basically saying, we're required by law to pay you X. So what we'll do is we'll make you work twice as long, and then you have to give us for the same amount of money, or we'll pay you X and you have to give us 50% cash back. Go to the ATM, get it out, give us cash back, right? And so this was documented sort of almost systematically across 7-Eleven franchisees. It was huge in the media. It was enormous damage to their brand. But the other things that we've seen that are sort of related to that maybe haven't come to fruition yet are personal liability for CEOs. And board members for criminal penalties up to 2 years jail time.
Wow.
Which is a pretty big stick from the government. And then recently, last weekend, actually, the government announced new offences under the Migration Act. These are proposed. They're open for submissions for the next couple of weeks. But they would remove access to non-citizen workers for organizations who are found to have breached immigration laws. So if you're a retailer, or if you're in, say, fast food has a lot of reliance in Australia on temporary visa holders, particularly international students. If you lose access to that market because, your outlet in some suburban town has been breaching the laws and you lose it nationally for 12 months, that's a really big deal. Yeah. So we think that there is... the landscape is changing. B, people are becoming more and more aware of the way that their brand is linked to their reputation and the risks are potentially not worth it. And then C, this issue of personal liability for directors. And most of I don't think I'm aware. I haven't spoken to one person who's in this position who actually knew that before I had that conversation.
Wow. That would be really, if I was a large brand and the thought of a small branch screwing everything up for the entire country's presence would definitely push me if I was the leader to say, okay, we gotta make sure that our compliance is up to par, because we can't let somebody who maybe accidentally or whatever, breaches some sort of or violates some kind of an obligation or a law. That's really interesting. We have something similar in the US for H-1Bs. If you violate H-1B compliance X number of times, I don't remember actually. I should probably know all of the compliance ramifications. But you can be disbarred from or disallowed from using H-1B for a certain number of, I think it's 2 years, but it's a certain number of time if you're found to have multiple violations. So it's not forever, but for companies that rely on foreign skilled talent to come in on H-1B visas, they better make sure that they're in compliance, because they don't want to be, they don't want to be limited to not to using H-1Bs if they're found to be in violation.
So, yeah, and we actually have a similar regime for our main sponsored work visa, which is called the 482.
Right.
But that only applies to those sponsored visas. And what's become obvious in Australia, and it's probably quite different from the US, just from a labour market perspective, but there's huge reliance in Australia in retail, in hospitality, and in agriculture on these temporary visa holders, whether they're student visa holders or working holiday sort of backpackers. Huge reliance. And so the government at the moment can't stop you from employing those people, but the new proposed laws would, and that would be really significant. So it's sort of taking at the moment the ban is on the H-1Bs and saying, well, now we're going to cover the rest of the pie. So
that's big.
It is big. It is. Yeah, that's right. And so I think that there's that's also a big selling point, going to be a big selling point for us for the Complize business going forward, because our value proposition was mainly focused on those large H-1B, large sponsored visa holders, hospitals, universities, multinational IT, this sort of stuff. And now with this expansion of the risk, we will have a much stronger business case for retail, for hospitality, for agriculture.
So that leads me to my, a question that I always like to ask, which is, what do you think is in store? Where are you looking forward? What are you looking forward at with Complize? I know you recently launched, so I'm sure, there's of course just the growth of business with the product as is, but I don't know, do you have anything on your roadmap or anything that you want to share that you're excited about, or maybe just ideas of where you think immigration technology, perhaps even just for compliance, is moving? Kind of what are your thoughts about the next few years, whether for Complize or more generally?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I might share one of my fears, first of all. And one of my fears is that, immigration is a pretty narrow slice. And when you look at some of the big players in the HRIS market, I think it wouldn't be too hard for, they're obviously looking at all these associated areas, whether it's payroll or whatever, to expand their offering, right? To offer this very sort of end-to-end service for organizations. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a large number of organizations like Complize or any other compliance sort of businesses being snapped up into this marketplace, because I think that would make their offering a lot more complete. And then I think on the other hand, you've got more of this sort of Benevo sort of model where it's more sort of the global mobility and that sort of stuff. And there's a lot of synergy between the broader global mobility case matter management and the compliance piece and this sort of stuff. So I think the future for the technology in this area is going to be expanding out into those associated areas. Now, whether that's because you become the dominant, no one knows, I think, at the end of the day, who's going to win out here. Is it Beta or VHS? But I think that the reality is the future for immigration compliance is as part of a broader, more integrated network for providers and for clients, whether that's immigration tax, global mobility, whether that's payroll, HR, and immigration. But I think the future is integrated from my perspective. And I think there's also another couple of models there, whether it's national, whether it's multinational. I've already seen that a large number of the HR platforms are going multinational very quickly. I was looking at one the other day that has, because there's all these different pathways you can take, right? Like you might say, okay, we're in the US, we're going to go to the UK, we're going to go to Australia, Anglosphere sort of thing. One of the products I saw yesterday, they've gone Australia, and then they've gone Malaysia, Singapore, into Southeast Asia, right? So there's all these different potential ecosystems and networks and stuff that people follow. In terms of what's the future for us, I think it's, we're more at this point where we're We're sharpening our value proposition for clients. We're really looking to work with clients to understand better what it is that they want our platform to do. We're only one step beyond MVP. We're at sort of version 1.0. We still see a lot of improvements that we need to do in our product. From my side, I think one of those expansions that I really want to get right is the risk and compliance side. So it's not enough to have this database. Immigration risk fits into this broader sort of enterprise risk management space. How do we quantify risk in the platform? How do we manage risk in the platform for these big players? Because I think that's both a liability issue for the platform as well as the client, and something that you've got to get right before you can really say, hey, this is a full suite compliance product, if that makes sense. So
100%. Yeah, I think the same thing. I actually find it interesting because I've thought about, and I've had conversations with companies in different sectors who all look at immigration compliance in a different way. So for example, maybe it's from a job posting type of company. They want to be able to, handle all the job postings for an organization. But then if a subset of those job postings are for somebody who is a foreign national, is there a separate module to handle that? It can also, that same thing can live within an HRIS, right? It can also live within an immigration case management platform where the company is handling all the cases. And then as part of that, they want to see the compliance aspect of it. So it's kind of interesting. It can definitely sit within all these, and all of them make sense. And I'm actually just curious to see, I think the way it's going to go is going to depend on who wants to spend the time and effort and money to integrate immigration compliance. If the HR systems have enough money and they think that the demand is acute, I think maybe they're the ones who are going to make the move. On the flip side of it, there's immigration technology obviously is growing. There are a lot of companies raising money and growing quite aggressively, both nationally, let's say within the US, and then internationally as well. Maybe for them, compliance makes the most sense. So yeah, it's interesting. It's cool to be in it. It is quite narrow, as you said, but it touches on a lot of different aspects of employment, which I think also creates a lot of different opportunities. So I think it's kind of a cool Wild West right now.
Yeah, I agree. It is. There's just so much overlap. It does touch on so many different areas, and my awareness is probably linked more to the products that are linked to specific firms, and even if they're not necessarily actually fully rolled out, they are just part of at the moment part of the firm's integrated or internal sort of case management offering, right? But I think when I look at this space, I just think the people with the cash at this point in time are the HR people. Yeah. Global mobility kind of lags a bit. It's obviously a big area. It has huge potential, but HR is kind of 3-4 years ahead of us. And when we see that, these companies being valued at $1 billion, $2 billion, they're the ones I think who are going to be able to make a play to be a more complete player in the market. I don't know that that's the way it will end. And as you say, like that module, right, that immigration module add-on in their HR system might only attract 5% of their users, 10% of their users, right? So from a value proposition for them, it might be too narrow anyway to worry about. So yeah, it is kind of the Wild West, and it'll be fascinating to see the way that it goes. And I think it also sort of, to step back into the COVID mode, there is, I think, a natural alignment between the case management and the compliance offering, but also like the broader movement piece, right? Just like the visa piece. And it'll be interesting to see how issues like COVID risk management for organizations and this COVID passport concept sort of play out, because again, they're two sort of relatively new areas, I think, that will have some involvement with the immigration technology as we go forward, because I know that immigration passports as a concept are so controversial in Australia. And yet we're already seeing Qantas, the national carrier, saying this week that they are going to implement, COVID passports. So how that plays out, whether there is an overlap with the immigration technology, I think will be really interesting.
That's fast. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about it from that perspective, but absolutely. Passport to passport, whether it's based on your nationality or it's based on your whether you had a COVID vaccine, it's it still is taken into account with travel. So to sort of end this conversation, I try to end on more maybe like a fun or an interesting question. Where do you think? I mean, and I say this also because we met internationally, for both of us, right? You were outside of your home country, I was outside of mine. When the border does open up, do you know where you're going to go first?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in Australia for a long time, the conversation has been around travel bubbles. Okay, because there's this ongoing issue, I think, with COVID in an environment like Australia, where we focused on COVID zero, which is obviously not the case in Europe or the US, but it is in other parts of the world, Australia, New Zealand, potentially some parts of Asia. So this idea of the travel bubbles, and my thinking has always been that the most likely travel bubbles for Australia would be New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and I want to go back to South Korea. I went to South Korea with my wife and little kids a couple of years ago. Everyone was so friendly. The food was absolutely amazing. It's such a different culture. I have so little knowledge about it that, you're just really surprised around sort of every corner. And we were in Seoul, I think, for about 2 weeks last time. And so I've actually got some South Korean friends. And so we would like to do like a family trip, the two families together, go back to South Korea and rent like an Airbnb house and just chill out, because when you got little kids, you don't want to be, doing a different town every sort of 2 or 3 days, but just rent a house in South Korea and chill out and enjoy it, because that seems low risk to me, but it's also sufficiently exotic that it meets my cultural and food needs.
I'm curious, what was your favorite food from Seoul, if you remember?
Actually, Korean dumplings. I wasn't really familiar with Korean dumplings. Like they're influenced by Chinese dumplings. They're influenced by Japanese dumplings, but they're uniquely Korean. And they were really, really, really great. Melbourne has a huge South Korean community. And so I'm familiar with a lot of the foods. But the dumplings were new to me.
I was actually, I go to Koreatown here in New York City very often for dinner and for karaoke, for other sorts of things. My improv theater actually had their training studio there. So I was there at least once a week. So obviously I've been to a lot of the places. Korean fried chicken is something that is very popular, at least here. And so when I visited Seoul a number of years ago, and I went to one of these, fried chicken spots and sat down. The thing that I really loved most about it was that they give you the full chicken. And so you get parts of the chicken that I eat them here, but Americans really don't, like the neck, for example. I love the neck, and you don't ever get that in restaurants typically. And I remember, I'll never forget it. They brought out the platter, they obviously cut it up in different pieces. And I was like, wow, I get the whole thing. And, yeah, that was just memorable to me, of like, it's such a simple thing, but it's a respect for the entire animal, I guess, rather than just cutting off a few pieces and then the rest of it goes to discard or dog food or whatever they do with it. So man, now you got me hungry and thinking about Korean food. So one last question, where can folks learn more about Complize? The website, I think, is complize.com.au, right?
Yeah, that's right. It is complize.com.au. We tried to get complize.com, but it's a link to some sort of German soccer club. Very, very strange. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, complize.com.au has got all the relevant information. Also on LinkedIn, we post a lot. We cross-post a lot from our blog. And feel free to hit me up, add me on LinkedIn if you haven't already. I'd love to connect with people.
Awesome. Well, Jackson, thank you so much. This was awesome. So interesting. And really love learning about your background, and particularly your hometown. Which is it sounds like a really wonderful place that I hope folks. What was the name of it again?
It's called Shepparton. I might share some info on LinkedIn about it.
Awesome.
So you can see some more around it.
Yeah, I love to see that, because it really is it really does seem like it was the sort of a foundation of your outlook on life, seeing people from all over the world. So thank you for sharing everything. Congrats on launching and having Complize 1.0. I look forward to 2.0, 3.0, and maybe you'll come back here and share more as things grow with Complize and talk about what you're seeing, evolve.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure, Roman, and we'll have to give you a demo sometime.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jackson. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too. Awesome. So excited every single time. These conversations, you get the whole story. I mean, you really see the arc of why all of our guests do what they do, why they've built what they've built, and what I think really paints a really wonderful picture of where the immigration technology space is going worldwide, right? Not just for me in the US, but really worldwide. So thank you all for watching and for being here, for your comments, for your support. See you here next week. And depending on where you are in the world, have a great rest of your day, or have a good Saturday and good morning. And see you next week. Peace out and stay safe.